Hello everyone, this is Eva Nolik-Smith with YogaUOnline, and I feel very privileged to be here today with renowned yoga teacher Natasha Rizopoulos. Natasha has been a dedicated yoga practitioner since she discovered yoga in her early 20s. She is now a senior teacher with Down Under Yoga in Boston. She is a writer, teacher of teachers, and a frequent contributor to Yoga Journal, both as a writer and at conferences. Natasha is known worldwide for her ability to communicate the essence of sophisticated postures and ideas in ways that have a transformative effect on one's understanding of yoga. And her yoga training includes extensive studies both in the Ashtanga yoga tradition and in Iyengar yoga. And she is also the founder of her own style of yoga called Align Your Flow. Natasha, welcome. We're so happy to have you.
So happy to be here.
Now, you are as passionate about your teaching of yoga as you are about your yoga practice. And you said that you feel that yoga ultimately is about helping us get in touch with our deepest self. So what does that mean to you in a modern Western context?
Well, there's so many layers to that, but I think one of the most significant ones is that in this modern Western world, we are so overstimulated and so inundated with nonstop stimuli and inputs. And there's this kind of extraordinarily hectic pace to life that really just in the last 10 years has increased exponentially. When I began practicing yoga, I didn't have a cell phone and no one I knew had a cell phone. We didn't email. There wasn't quite so much going on. And as a result, I think it actually was easier to focus and quiet the mind. So for me, the practice of asana is essentially an opportunity, beyond, of course, its myriad physical benefits, to kind of relearn how to do just one thing at a time and how to be completely present, and to have that ekagrata, that single-pointed focus, for more than a minute or two, for the length of an asana practice, whether it's half an hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours, recognizing, of course, that the attention will come and go. But to me, this really is the most powerful and transformative aspect of asana in the culture we live in now, where most people are doing, I'm not exaggerating in any way when I say most people are doing 3 or 4 things simultaneously all the time. So to have this opportunity to just do one thing with utter focus and commitment, it changes your mind. And ideally, having had that experience on the mat and feeling how powerful it is and how restorative it is, we then perhaps feel inspired to do it elsewhere.
Right. And what was it when you first came to yoga in your 20s? What was it about it that made you so passionate about your practice that you basically dedicated your life to studying and teaching yoga?
It just was that I finished practicing and I felt completely different than I had when I came in. And there was really a feeling of almost a mental cleansing that had occurred. That first Shavasana was so magical. And I emerged from it just elated and not in a kind of wired up, caffeinated way, but just alert, and alive to the possibility of just daily life in simple ways, and I think so many people have that experience when they first come to yoga, that it's such a distinct difference from their daily life. Of course, my concern is that more and more the way yoga is trending, yoga is starting to look like daily life instead of presenting an alternative experience. There's a lot of music, there's a lot of kind of I don't know, I don't want to use the word frenzied, but almost there's a frenzied aspect to a lot of yoga practices these days. And to me, the beauty of asana is that you have this experience that is not that hectic, frenzied daily life experience that so many people feel plagued by.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you used earlier the phrase ekagrata, one-pointed focus, to describe your approach to teaching and to practice. Now, is this what we understand by mindfulness, that you are with one thing at a time?
I really think it is. I mean, in my most recent teacher training weekend, we were in our philosophy conversation, we were talking about the difference between mindfulness and meditation and what is the difference. And for me, the mindfulness is that you are very consciously doing whatever it is you are doing. Whereas meditation for me has a slightly more unconscious quality. There's almost an absence of one uses an ekagrata practice to arrive at a place of then completely diffuse attention, as opposed to when I'm practicing asana, throughout, I really am trying to keep the single pointed focus. And then that allows me to have a kind of meditative experience when I practice shavasana. But so I would say that is the difference, that when we practice asana, it really is a practice of mindfulness that can then, as I say, inform how you are when you're not practicing asana, so that you can find the pleasure in doing one thing with complete attention. And recognizing, of course, there are things that we do that are not pleasant and that not too much we can do is going to make them pleasant. But actually, many life tasks are immeasurably more pleasant if we actually do them, as opposed to getting through them while simultaneously doing three other things.
Right, right, yeah. Yeah, you also said that yoga offers us a new perspective on our often wayward thoughts and feelings. And of course, there's like two aspects to that. There's both the aspect of, just being able to focus and being mindful on one thing and on the present. But there's also the aspect of that in yoga that is often referred to as the concept of creating space, holding space for whatever feelings come up, whatever emotions come up, whatever thoughts come up, and just allowing them to be without reacting to them. Is that part of what you mean by the ekagrata as well?
Yes and no. I mean, I think the ekagrata is a sort of training of the mind in the same way that we train the musculoskeletal system to sort of, we're trying to strengthen our power of attention. The being present with, but not reacting to, I think is a little bit different. And the two can coexist and support each other. But, for me, one of the beauties of, and one of the things that I find so appealing about a meditation practice is that all thoughts are equal. So, in other words, thoughts that could be hot button thoughts, and we all have them, the sort of trigger red flag thoughts, then catalyze a whole emotional response. Whatever those thoughts or sort of buzzwords are, when they come up in meditation, they're no more important than, candle or plate, and that there's something about letting all thoughts drift by when we meditate that equalizes them. And that when we learn to do that in meditation, in other words, you use the phrase holding space, but in other words, everything is equal within that space. We don't have to immediately have a certain kind of response to a certain kind of thought. In certain asana poses, we have emotional responses. Hip openers are typical, but for some people, back bends. For some people, inversions, because there can be fear around inversions. And I think the beauty of asana is that we learn to be present even when we're having strong feelings. So a feeling of fear comes up, a feeling of self-doubt comes up, a feeling of competitiveness, whatever the default sort of mode is when we are under duress or stress. And yet if we have a consistent asana practice, we notice the feeling, but it doesn't have to run the show. We're not completely victimized by it. So it exists and we acknowledge it, but we don't have to then kind of turn ourselves over to the feeling. It can be there, and we can continue to be mindful and to practice.
Yeah, I think it's one of the beautiful things about yoga is that you develop that somatic awareness, and you can experience feeling as a presence in your body, and also it being a presence in your body as well as a presence in your mind. And so, for example, an emotion like anger, which can be very difficult to deal with, you don't have to kind of get off on it. You can allow it to be there and kind of run its course, which isn't necessarily pleasant, but it's, always kind of a period of time before it sort of dissipates and you then have the advantage that you didn't pick a fight with your spouse.
Yes. Yeah, there's a noticing, and then there's sort of developing the skill to not necessarily react, right? It's that creating space.
Now, you created your own style of yoga that you refer to as Align Your Flow Yoga. So what inspired that, and what is your focus? What are you seeking to accomplish with that?
Well, I guess, there are so many styles of flow yoga, of vinyasa yoga, out in the world at this point. It feels like a very ubiquitous idea. And I wanted to distinguish the way that I teach, and to be really clear that I teach an alignment-based vinyasa practice. I come from the Ashtanga method. The linking of breath and movement is very powerful for me. But I've had many Iyengar teachers. I'm now primarily a student of the Iyengar method, and the emphasis on alignment is so powerful for me because I feel that it allows us to find the fullest expression of postures the safest way. And that's a powerful combination to both have the full expression of the pose and the safe expression. Sometimes it seems like you can have one or the other. You can do a very cautious pose, but not really get very many benefits because you're tiptoeing. Or then there's the other end of the spectrum where you see people pushing themselves in this very aggressive way that feels overly ambitious, and not tethered by an anatomical understanding. And so I want students to have the full expression, the greatest benefit, and not get hurt. So that's sort of the literal idea behind Align Your Flow. But also there's a more sort of meta idea of, I remember years ago, it must have been in the 90s, reading about this idea of flow, that when people are in flow, and they'd done all these studies about it, there was a kind of timelessness, like people would be completely engaged by an activity and they would literally lose all track of time and be just completely lit up and energized and just in a flow. I mean, I remember reading about this before I had a consistent practice and just it really affecting me as an idea. So part of Align Your Flow is also this idea of not just physical alignment, but aligning yourself. This is to come back to your first question, with your true self and with a self that can be completely absorbed and can be timeless and not plugged into the daily grind, but is actually in some way, there's a part of us that is beyond our physical self, and we tend to define ourselves by our physical selves, by the adjectives and nouns that people would use to describe us. And yet there's another self, a big S self, that I think many of us get little glimpses of during asana, during meditation. It is beyond all of those adjectives and nouns. So there's that bigger idea that when we can align the physical body, then there is a shift that happens mentally as well, and that you can align yourself with your true self.
Yeah. And having had the privilege to do many of your yoga practice on our video channel, I know that you have a unique ability to sort of create a very meditative process of your practices by picking one or two elements of your physical / somatic experience that you keep building on through the practice, and it really makes for, first of all, a very cohesive, integrated class, but also in a sense a very meditative quality, because you're experiencing this thing in your body that you keep building on, and everything kind of hangs together. So it's my compliments to you. I really enjoy that aspect of your teaching.
Thank you. I mean, that's certainly my intention. So I'm very pleased that that's the effect it has on you.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm also curious, in your own practice, has there been a particular group of postures that you found particularly challenging as you advanced?
Definitely. I have such a loose body. I have such a mobile body. And in particular, my shoulders are, I mean, I sometimes joke, I don't have pectoral muscles. But so throughout my practice, I mean, and that has made for ease in some families of postures like back bends, like twists. But as a result, inversions and arm balances were always a challenge for me because I just didn't have built-in stability. But of course, those are the poses that when you hang in and just practice patience and persistence over the years, as you develop strength, as you develop the ability to do postures that when you first met them seemed like they were literally for another species, it's very gratifying, and not in a kind of achieve way, but more just the satisfaction of understanding that we do not need to be limited by our expectations and our assumptions about ourselves.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and of course you made reference to headstand and shoulderstand, Sirsasana and Sarvangasana, and those are probably two postures, particularly headstand, that many people feel challenged. And there has been, as we know, some controversy about those inversions as well, and I believe, as best I can tell, many teachers are kind of taking them out of their repertoire of teaching, of course depending on the level of their students and the age group. But it does seem like those poses are not so commonly seen in classes anymore. And at the same time, traditionally in the yoga tradition, they were referred to as the king of asana and the queen of asana. So what is your take on it? Should we avoid those poses out of fear of injuring our students or ourselves, or is there a way that we can keep them in the yoga repertoire but also keep students safe?
I mean, obviously, you need to know who you're teaching. I don't teach beginner classes. I teach intermediate and advanced classes. And at least once a month, I do an entire class devoted to Sirsasana and then another class devoted to Sarvangasana, because I do think many students are practicing them, and I want them to practice them safely. And I believe they can be practiced safely, barring some kind of an injury, and also understanding that we're human beings and things happen, You can walk across a room and break your toe tripping over a rug, But to me, they're important postures because they are part of the canon. And as I say, because people are practicing them. I would never teach Sarvangasana without the full panoply of props. So part of the reason that I teach it at least once a month is that I want students to understand that I don't think it is safe to practice it without multiple blankets, without a strap, without a block, without the ability to put the feet on something in halasana, whether it's the floor or a bolster or a chair or the wall. And I think that the setup is incredibly important. And so I want students to hear the setup and to experience it done correctly, so that they then know, if they're in a class 2 weeks later at a gym where there are no blankets and the instructor says, okay, now we're going to do shoulder stand, they can hopefully make the decision to instead do Viparita Karani at the wall. And I try and be as explicit as possible when I instruct about the why of every choice that I make in terms of alignment and in terms of props. Sirsasana was, I would say, the most challenging pose for me of all of the poses. I had a lot of fear with it. I had a Abhinivesha kind of a fear, like a clinging to bodily life fear, a falling over. And it was so powerful for me in the first decade of my practice to little by little, with the help of responsible, reliable teachers, chip away at that fear and build a headstand practice, which is absolutely central to my daily practice now. And is such an important pose for me. And I'm so grateful that I had the journey that I had with it. The one other thing I'd want to say about teaching these poses is that if you teach them, you also need to have an array of modifications in your back pocket, so that if I've got a class of 35 or 40 people, my assumption is that 10 of those people, when we finally get to shoulder stand, will not actually do shoulder stand, that they'll instead do one of a handful of modifications that I'll offer, because they're not yet ready to do the shoulder stand, but that regardless, they will have benefited from all of the preparation that we did on our way to shoulder stand, the mobilizing and strengthening of the thoracic, the opening of the shoulders, the strengthening of the legs. All of the work that we do on our way to shoulder stand is of value, even if you don't actually do the shoulder stand. And the same goes for Sirsasana for headstand.
Yeah, yeah. So that's interesting. You basically never teach them as part of a class. You always teach a class that builds up to them and they're
Yes.
the peak pose.
I mean, I would say the one caveat I would make to that would be that I teach a weekly master class, and the students that come to my master class all have quite advanced practices. So that would be a circumstance in which at the end of class I would say, okay, now we'll do shoulder stand, and do that as a kind of cooling counter pose after having taught a back bending class, for instance, because I know that the students in that class have the experience, have the knowledge to either go up with some ease with me giving just a few basic instructions in Sarvangasana, or to know that they're not ready and to do the alternative that I offer.
And in terms of sequencing for either a shoulder stand or a headstand, there is the short-term sequencing that you do within the class, but then there's also the long-term sequencing, as in your case, right, where there's not just what you do within a limited, but also what you have to build up in the body.
Yes. Yes. So I think of those as the homework poses. And certainly a big part of the course that we'll be doing is really being clear about what those homework poses are, so that there is, for each pose, for both Sirsasana and Sarvangasana, there's a handful of postures that I assign to my students. And I say to them, I want you to do these poses every day. Now, recognizing that every day might be 5 days a week or 4 days a week, but that these are poses that students commit to, with the understanding that after a couple of months of doing them regularly, most of them will feel real changes in their musculoskeletal system that will make the work that we do in a given class much more accessible.
Right. So one of your favorites, I know, is forearm plank.
Yes. Forearm plank and a baby cobra variation. So this idea of strengthening the front body and developing stability at the center in the forearm plank, but it must be balanced by strengthening the back body in a baby cobra variation. And the really important piece of that is that it's a prone back bend in which you're not relying upon your arm strength to create the back bend, but that in fact you're having to use the spinal muscles and the muscles of the upper back to do the lifting. And because that's such a weak area for so many students. And if that area of the body is dull or weak or just concrete, it directly impacts the ability to do headstand and shoulder stand.
Yeah, yeah. And how do you help students overcome the fear element, which I think is, probably almost universal?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's an asset to me that I myself was afraid in headstand, because I really have compassion. I really get why it's hard for people. For me, and therefore it's what I teach, the thing that eroded the fear over time was having a very clear methodology. So having actions that I practiced every day with non-attachment to result. So for instance, with handstand, when I work with students, I say to them, I want you to assume you are not going to get up into handstand, and I want you to only be interested in the entrance actions. In other words, we're going to set you up 5 or 6 inches from the wall in downward facing dog, and I'm going to show you a very specific method. And then you just practice the method again and again and again and again until it becomes as natural to you as doing downward facing dog. And when it starts to feel natural, then you'll start to build confidence. And when the confidence builds, you'll practice with a little bit more vigor, but it will be an organic, progressive build. And so there's this, to me, that's key, that I used these words before, but patience and persistence are really the cornerstone of building an inversions practice and not being attached to result. So abhyasya vairagya, persistent effort with non-attachment to result. And I think if students are not trying to get up, if they're just trying to learn actions, that is absorbing, right? That is ekagrata. And if you're absorbed by pressing down through every knuckle and lifting the bicep and engaging the tricep and having a steady drishti, if you're thinking about all of those things, you're not thinking about how afraid you are. And in my experience, when students go through a period like that of really just committing to actions, but not to the pose sometimes sneaks up on them in a very delightful way.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Now you have a course on YogaU about inversions, particularly Sirsasana and Sarvangasana, as part of a series of courses you're doing on sequencing for more challenging yoga postures. So tell us about your Inversions course and what you are covering in that.
So there'll be a variety of elements. I will spend a decent amount of time in each course. It's a 2-part course, being explicit and I hope inspirational about those homework postures. So what you described as the kind of long-term sequencing that needs to happen as you build an inversions practice. And then I'm also going to go over, for each pose, a couple of different sequences with a different kind of emphasis. So for instance, when you're building a Sarvangasana practice, it's very important that the shoulders are open in external rotation and extension. So there's a whole shoulder opening element that is crucially important. So we'll talk about a sequence built around that idea. Also the idea of mobilizing the thoracic, which is so key, mobilizing and strengthening the thoracic. And then also this idea of core stability and what it means to have integrity at the center. So we'll look at, for each pose, a couple of different specific sequences that you can practice. Each one has a different focus so that you can, because hopefully students are able to identify with help from a teacher what it is that's inhibiting their inversions practice. And that way you can choose to do a practice that is more focused and geared around your individual needs.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It sounds like, all that prep work, even though you're targeting it for headstand and shoulderstand, is really essential work for all aspects of your yoga practice.
Without a doubt. I mean, I will say, and I'm sure I'll say it during the course as well, I assign this handful of postures to all of my students. And truly the ones who do it, within a couple of months, maybe 3, maybe 4, see dramatic changes across the board in their asana practice. And the students who don't commit, they, of course they still have a wonderful experience, but they don't have quite the same vivid changes. I've had, students in their late 50s who were never able to do inversions and now can do all of them. Students who've made huge breakthroughs with Urdhva Dhanurasana, students who have made breakthroughs with arm balances. All aspects of the asana practice can be impacted by these handful of homework postures. And I speak from experience because they really changed my practice, even though I myself had been practicing for probably 15 years before I started teaching and practicing these poses all the time myself as well.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, Natasha, we're really looking forward to your course, and thank you so much for taking the time also to join us today.
A pleasure.